colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce tonight the inaugural lecture of Callum Brown, the Professor of Late Modern European History. Although I worked alongside Callum at Strathclyde for 7 years, I never met him.
No. That's a comment on Strathclyde.
And so I knew he'd gone to Dundee, and it was tremendous to be able to appoint him back here. Callum has achieved very considerable distinction as a historian, not only through his 3 chairs and his fellowship with the Royal Society of Edinburgh and other recognition, but also because he is in many ways the author of the late onset secularization thesis, pitching the enormous social changes brought about by secularization at a much later date than many writers. I'm very glad to see here such an audience of colleagues who are loyal in supporting these inaugurals organised by the School of Humanities, and I'm particularly glad to see so many senior colleagues from out with the School of Humanities who come to support it tonight. I should say that after the conclusion of this lecture there will be no questions, as is customary with inaugural lectures, and Lynn has asked me to say that there will instead be a direct migration to drinks, which are in the forehall. But I won't detain you longer because the business of the evening is with Callum, and Callum is going to speak to us tonight on something at the core of his concerns: secularization and civilization. Can history show if society is good without God? Colleagues, Callum Brown.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'm very flattered. On the overhead, you can see a sign that was erected by the Roads Authority of Utah State in the United States to indicate that a voluntary group has adopted a stretch of road to undertake periodic cleaning up of garbage. This is a low-level moral action, a kind of simple, visual, environmental cleanup, and resonates with a sense of civic pride, of moral action, and community belonging. With it, too, comes an enhancement of fellowship, of people working together in a sociable manner for a common good. It generally signifies a moral good, except when a stretch of Interstate 55 in Missouri was adopted by the Ku Klux Klan. But in Utah's case, there is a deep contradiction in this sign. Utah is, by some measures, the most religious state of the Union, and by those same measures may be amongst the most religious places of the Western world. In 2000, 74.7% of Utah residents were recorded as church adherents, just ahead of North Dakota on 73.2%. Now compare this with the state of the Union with the lowest level of religious belonging, Oregon, which has but 31% church adherents. And compare also with Scotland in the same year of 2000, when 24% of Scots were religious adherents, and that figure has since dropped considerably. Yet this stretch of highway has been adopted by Utah atheists. Research published in 2005 by 3 American sociologists showed that so hostile were Americans to the term atheist that it was easier for people to come out as gay than to come out as atheists. The action of Utah atheists is part of a worldwide campaign that is spread like wildfire, which argues that people can be good without God. Where before atheists and free thinkers campaigned mainly for civil rights issues, notably to be free from religion, they now also spend as much time campaigning to be seen as the moral heart of society. Now, of course, atheists have a long history of trying to change morality. From the 1870s, Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant in this country were campaigning for artificial birth control, a campaign that atheists still take to be their special domain. Most recently, humanists and atheists have been at the forefront of the campaign for dignity in dying and for decriminalization of assisted suicide. In very many different ways, the content of Western morality has been changing. The codes of what is deemed to be moral has been changing quite significantly. And an argument can be made that step by step for 130 years or so, it has been to a great extent secular people who have led this change of morality. Now this process is growing. Levels of church adherence, religious faith and identity, and belief in God and an afterlife are in rapid decline in virtually every country in the West. Not merely just in the usual suspects of Scandinavia, Western Europe, New Zealand, or Canada, but in the last 10 years there has been significant drop in religious identity in as places as diverse as Malta, which is the most religious place in Europe, Ireland, Brazil, and in the United States. As a result, we need to think about the era we are living in as a transition from a social world dominated by faith to one increasingly dominated by no faith. And with it, there are consequences for the nature of our government, our social norms, and our social behavior, as well as just for beliefs. In short, there is a case to be considered that secularization is upon us as a civilization-changing phenomenon. Is secularization bad for civilization? Such a claim has been made by historians and social scientists over the years and has been deeply embedded in the discipline of religious history and the writing of religious history, and indeed amongst the writing of general historians as well. The very rhetoric by which the religious history of the modern world is written concerns loss. Until the 1970s, it was routine rhetoric in academic history to speak of the growth of the lapsed masses, the sunken portion, of heathens. The most recent comprehensive ecclesiastical histories of modern Scotland, written in the late 1970s by A.L. Drummond and J. Bullock, described the social structure of industrial Scotland as, quote, a pyramid and its broad base was pagan. Terms like pagan, and especially heathen, peppered the textbooks and the research monographs without quotation mark. And indeed, I started my PhD at a time when virtually every book on the social history of religion in Britain had this terminology. In this rhetoric lay a barbed moral judgment. With most historians being Christian, the historical narrative was closely allied to the designs of Christians who were its heroes. One senses this in the work of Professor Keith Robbins, professor in modern history here at Glasgow for many years. He wrote admiringly of various ways in which Christianity continued to define the work of government in the 20th century. Even during the Second World War, he said, when British emissaries were sent to the United States to convince the Americans that 500 years of Christian civilization were about to be destroyed by the Nazis and they should enter the Second World War, he noted that this rhetoric was used in propaganda even when Britain's leaders, including Churchill and Attlee, were not noted as major, as he called it, major professing Christians. A consequence of the way religious history has dominated the study of the social history of morality is that when religion started to decline rapidly in the 1960s and the 1970s, an evidence-based argument started to emerge that secularization was bad for civilization. First in the field was a sociologist, still Professor Emeritus at the University of Reading, Christy Davis, who published two major books, one in 1975 and one in 2005, in which he argued that the religious decline that accompanied the swinging 60s, the summer of love, and modern youth culture, had started to rip the moral heart out of Britain. Specifically, he pointed to the rise of permissiveness, ranging from sexual permissiveness to governmental, and how it was atheists who were the most important group in the House of Commons in promoting the liberal hour of the 1960s. He argued that the divorce law reform, decriminalisation of homosexuality, the end of censorship, and other measures, which he regarded as permissive, were in the Commons supported most by atheists. In his 1975 book, his chapter 5 was entitled, as you can see, Buggery and the Decline of the British Empire, which gives you a little bit of a drift. This story was taken on in the 1990s by an American historian, Gertrude Himmelfarb, who wrote a large monograph called The Demoralization of Society, which argued at length that industrialization in the 19th century coincided with a religious boom, and which promoted middle-class manners, the idealization of the moral family, and women's place in the home as being the moral linchpin of modern society. From the end of the 19th century, in her story, it all started to go wrong. There was a rise of crime linked to the decline of religion. There was a decline of manners, which went along with the decline of the family and role models. She was scathing on the influence of new women and feminists, particularly feminists, and identified the waning of the moral example of Victorian stay-at-home wives and mothers, whose virtues exemplified for her Christian civilization. She also condemned the welfare state of the mid-20th century, which she wrote lacked any kind of moral calculus. Whilst the 60s counterculture, liberal values, and Bill Clinton, she said, produced a society lacking, quote, moral and spiritual character. This type of argument is not confined to the religious historian. Neil Ferguson self-describes as an atheist and says he has always been one and has never had a religion to lose. But he says the 10 Commandments of Christianity are a useful guide to how to live well. In his book on civilization, he goes further. In it, he trusts to the judgment of the West's enemies in assessing the moral functioning of Western civilization. He cites scholars of the Chinese Academy of the Social Sciences who judged that the moral and military strength of the West lies in Christianity. In its economy, with its efficient, largely corruption-free culture, comes, he says, a moral foundation of Christianity. The danger in declining Christianity, Ferguson says, is what might replace it. He quotes Chesterton, that hard-shelled materialists will hold a belief in almost anything, including Islamism and what Ferguson calls postmodern cults, like aromatherapy and Zen. Ferguson comes across as a post-Christian supporter of Christian historians of old, who hold to the necessity of Christianity to all that is great in Britain. In contrast to the religious historian, can the humanist historian, working with evidence-based argument, contribute to this discussion? Can we show if people can be, according to the publicity of the time, good without God? The social evidence for me starts with Aberdeen University psychologist Margaret Knight, who in the 1950s collected data from psychologists and sociologists in various countries, ranging from the Netherlands to Australia, which showed that the prison population of the West had a disproportionately high number of Catholics. Contradicting that, Christian moralists could point to data from the 1960s to the 1980s from virtually all Western nations that seemed to show that crime was rising as religious adherence was falling. And at the time, those critics were right. I apologize for delving into a few statistics. If they cause you problems, close your eyes. Here are the data from Scotland. In the top graph, I'm showing the number of persons convicted of both indictable and non-indictable offences in Scotland from 1908 to 2000. You can see here that the numbers rose continuously, reaching a peak in 1980 at a peak of 243,000 convictions, equivalent to just under 5% of the population. being equivalent to 5% of the population. The bottom graph, which is aligned date for date, shows the religious adherence per head of population in Scotland. And this shows that for the bulk of the 20th century, the proportion who were religious adherents was broadly level, except for a dip during the Second World War. So the peak in Scotland in the post-war years came in 1956, when 46% of the people were members of a Scottish church. But the story changes dramatically after 1980 for crime. From 1980 to 2000 in the top graph, you'll see that the number of crimes fall dramatically, by more than half by 2000 to 118,000 crimes, or 2.4% of the Scottish population, almost halved. Now, this has been mirrored across much of the Western world. The decline of crime since the late 1980s is now general in the Western world. Turning to the bottom graph again, you will see that this was over a period when religious adherence was declining markedly, and it is still declining. So, the reading of the link between crime and religion by both Christy Davis and Gertrude Himmelfarb was only right for a very brief historical period, the period from the 1950s to before the 1980s. And clearly, it's wrong afterwards. This is affirmed by a different statistical exercise which I did upon Scottish data, using snapshot statistics at one point in time. This is what is called a scattergram, which is intended to show if there's a link between two variables, in this case, levels of crime and levels of religious adherence. I took the 32 local authority areas recorded in the General Census of Scotland in 2011 and took from that census the proportion of the people who had no religion. And that's indicated along the bottom axis. The vertical axis records the only data I could locate, which is assorted by local authority area, and that is the number of social work reports prepared for the Scottish courts for those who are about to be sentenced after conviction of a crime. So I'm using this as a surrogate for crime data by local authority area, for which there don't appear to be any particular other sources. The result is that there is no connection between these two variables. If there was a relationship between crime and levels of no religionism in Scotland, one would expect the 32 local authority dots to be forming some kind of a line, usually a straight line, and they're not. It's a random distribution, and this is confirmed, for those who are technically minded, by a Pearson rank correlation coefficient of 0.013, which is extremely low. So this would tend to discount again the arguments of Christie and Himmelfarb. So the suggestion that crime rises as religiosity falls is firmly contradicted by this evidence from both time series and from snapshot data. At least in relation to crime, Western civilization is actually improving during the era since the 1980s, when religiosity has been declining the most. In short, the historian must conclude that given that the connection between crime and religion is so unstable according to period, that there is no universally applicable connection in the late modern period. And I want to turn back to Margaret Knight, who I introduced briefly before. In 1955, Margaret Knight was tormented by newspapers in Britain and around the world, as far away as the San Francisco Chronicle, after she gave two 30-minute lectures on the BBC Home Service in which she argued for morality without religion. She argued that children were harmed by an exclusive diet of Christian religious education in schools and should instead be taught secular humanism. For making these suggestions on radio, she was castigated variously as a communist and as a dangerous woman. The Daily Telegraph compared her propaganda to, quote, a serious apology for polygamy or homosexuality or any other manifestation of the frailties of human nature. The Daily Express canvassed widely for churchmen to attack Margaret Knight, and the Anglican Bishop of Coventry obliged. Under the banner, Bishop checks Mrs. Knight, this bossy female. The newspaper's front page lead story centred on him calling her, quote, this brusque, so competent, bossy female, adding, quote, she seemed a very simple-minded female to me, unquote. He did apologise 3 days later in the same newspaper, but only for the simple-minded female remark, not for the rest. The Knight affair was one of the loudest moral panics of post-war years, even to some extent eclipsing the Lady Chatterley trial panic of some 5 years later. It seemed on the face of it to show that Britons were not free to argue for morality without God. But British people quickly did. In the Knight affair, tens of thousands of people wrote letters to the BBC, to newspapers, including to the Daily Express, and to Knight herself. The BBC received some 5,000 letters. The Daily Express alone received 2,000, and Knight received 2,000. And 40% of all of those that went to the BBC and to the Express were in support of Knight's freedom to express herself and to be broadcast. They argued for a liberal position in our culture. They argued that she should be allowed to express her view, even if they did not agree with her. Within 7 years of this affair, the BBC was routinely broadcasting religious satire in the boom of comedy in the 1960s. Anti-establishment comedy undermined the religious platitudes of conservatives who felt that the BBC should only be acting as an agent of evangelization of the nation. People like Malcolm Muggeridge, Mary Whitehouse, Lord Longford formed in the late 60s and early 70s a group that pressurized the BBC to prevent the broadcasting of anything other than Christian views. This surge to freedom for atheists to express themselves in public culture was to transform Britain. It unleashed a sea change as hundreds of thousands found refuge from churches and religious structures in instead apathy and indifference. Morality started to be recrafted, and just as it did so, it started a recrafting, I would argue, of civilization itself. The British Social Attitudes Survey of 2011 found 82% of Britons support assisted dying, 82%, and 94% are in favour of legal abortion in some form or other. These are just two of a wide variety of indices which show that the claims of many churches to represent the moral positions of British people no longer apply. Goodness is changing. The type of goodness that we recognize in our society is changing. The goodness of the era of the religious West, just ending, was an era in which there was a religion based on men's, and it was mostly men's, claims to know a scripture which told of a central truth and offered easy to understand rules of behavior. These rules were non-negotiable and defined goodness. Charles Taylor, in his recent large book on the secular age, notes how the central truth of the Christian religion was under constant challenge, largely from the Enlightenment onwards. He notes that the nature of what was good was no longer so certain and so fixed, and became, as he describes it, modified by people's desires for the authentic. But still, the secular age of which he speaks was still, in his view, a Christian one. Indeed, he defines the secular age as still a religious period. He constructs, based on liberal theology from the 1960s onwards, a view of the secular as the Christian God's design. And the Christian church's duty in this design is to adapt to it, to modify the church and the nature of the faith to fit in with what God wants. This is the power of his idea of religious authenticity. But I would submit that authenticity works in a different way. People of the last 70 years have been, in quite significant numbers in the West, fleeing from religious humbug, religious commands, social conformities, religious-defined government laws, and also from community-defined laws derived from religion. Authenticity has been something being sought by the secular people of the world as well as the religious, by millions of people in the West who, one way or another, have largely since the 1960s lost their church, lost their faith, and the vast bulk of their ritual. It is especially upon women that the modern nature of goodness has shown the greatest degree of change. It was in the 1960s and the 1970s that the idea of the female homemaker, mother, as the agreed model of virtue started to wither quite rapidly. She it was who herself moved aside the traditional virtues of chastity and respectability and started to develop a new vision of, in many cases, women not becoming mothers, of women remaining childless throughout their lives by choice. Many women now in their senior years describe in their autobiographies this change. They describe their own journey from their mother's hopes for a perfect domestic woman, wrapped in tweed skirt and woolen jumper, to their own evolving new woman of the miniskirt, the jeans, of going to university, and of sexual freedom. One such woman was the British broadcaster Jenny Murray, who was raised in a northern English middle-class family of deep respectability, neither parent especially religious, but her mother creating what she described as a Christian atmosphere in which goodness was defined by conformity and discipline, conformity in traditional women's dress and sexual behavior. This resulted in a contest with her mother over how a young girl should express her femininity in the 1950s and 60s. Jenny Murray's autobiography is centered around the leading efforts of her mother to make her daughter ladylike and respectable. Jenny Murray says, "It seems astonishing to me now that so much time could have been spent on keeping up appearances and trying to figure out how to feminize such a natural tomboy to fit the requirements of the 1950s female ideal." Women's dress was an outer confirmation, she says, of conformity or of rebellion. Trousers or dungarees were out of the question for true conformity, as the actual wearing of the skirt demanded a unique performance of respectable femininity, actually embedded in the clothes. Jenny Murray reports the instructions given by her mother. In a skirt, it was always sit down nicely. Don't cross your legs. It's not polite to sit with your knees apart. Only boys and bad girls would sit like that. Put your legs to one side when you sit, and it's all right if you want to cross your ankles. That's quite dainty. Her mother despised the simple moralities of the unmarried mother. Jenny's mother was, she says, a believer in no sex before marriage and complete fidelity afterwards. But Jenny Murray rebelled. On applying to Hull University in the late 1960s, she had insisted on her application, "I was pretty much a heathen, northern working class, and I smoked like a chimney." On her first arrival at her digs, she marked her liberation from her mother's version of femininity when she, quote, "hitched up my skirt to make it even shorter and put up a poster displaying a woman having an orgasm and went straight to the student health centre, the pill centre as they were called in those days, to get the oral contraceptive. And once she had the hold of the pill, Murray recalled, we generally had a ball." From the 1960s, women all across the Western world went through variations on this transition, in which a residue of Christian belief in many cases was shed. In many cases, a woman began this transition within a church, but then left it to complete her journey. In 2009, I interviewed Tanya Long. Tanya was born in 1944 in a small mining town in northern Ontario in Canada. Her father was a nickel miner, and she was brought up a Lutheran. In the mid-1960s, she came to Toronto to study and met a young man and fell in love.
did you have any sort of developed religious ideas? Would you describe yourself as a Christian, as a child?
When I was a teenager, and I mean, not so much as a child, but when I was a teenager, I went through a period of a kind of religious fervor. And I even had an experience or two that like walking out, going for a walk, and it's being very foggy, and kind of thinking that I heard the voice of God. I mean, I think that only happened once, but yes, I did have a certain religious fervor throughout my adolescence and then into my young adulthood. And I actually married when I was 21. I met him at university. I married a man who was studying to be a minister. And the reason he came to university was because he had just been converted. And he was full of religious fervor. He really knew, he had been converted, and he was all gung-ho, and I fell in love with him, and we got married, and we had this vision of the two of us kind of sailing our ship, and he was going to be the captain, and I was going to be the helmsman, and we were going to go out there and do all these wonderful good deeds. Well, that lasted about 6 months. And in a way, as the marriage deteriorated, which it eventually did, because we should never have gotten married. We were too young, and we were both unhappy, needy young people, and we should never have married. And as the marriage deteriorated, both of our religious fervors kind of went by the wayside along with the marriage. And my husband never did end up becoming a minister. He got disillusioned. In fact, one time he told me that part of why he got disillusioned was because he was so turned off by my fervor that it looked ridiculous to him. So,
that being turned off by religious fervor is not a general phenomenon in the West, but is one that has grown. We have grown more suspicious, many of us, of the appearance of religious fervor in a way which Victorians, for instance, weren't. Tanya stayed a while in a liberal congregation of the United Church of Canada and was deeply proud when her church was the first in the world in 1974 to appoint a gay minister. She was dedicated to a whole series of liberal causes, helping the poor of Toronto, supporting the public housing campaign, and especially the gay liberation movement. But she later left the church, and she lost her Christianity on discovering that she no longer believed in even the liberal God of Paul Tillich. And instead she joined the Humanist Association of Toronto, which she now leads. Part of this journey was her own developing career as a publisher and her feminism.
It seems to me that the church has done more harm to women than just about any other institution. Now, I think there is an argument to be made the other way, because if a person named Jesus ever did exist, he probably was more aware of women and their rights as a person than anybody else in his society at that time. But it hasn't translated into the church by any stretch of the imagination. And I have a girlfriend who's Roman Catholic, and basically we just don't talk about it because the fact that they're anti-abortion, anti-gay, anti-ordination of women just infuriates me when I think about it. And there's, as far as I'm concerned, there's no rationalization for that because it's a denial of the full personhood of women. And so yes, I would say that my involvement in feminism did contribute to my moving further and further away from any kind of organized religion.
The full personhood of women becomes in the hands of many modern women the concept that redefines their goodness. Being good is no longer about managing to be as good as someone with God. It comes to be about being a necessity to be good. God, in their view, forestalls the development of a modern goodness. This journey for women is many and varied. The route that Tanya took is by no means the only route. Women have gone through identical stories and life journeys over the last 70 years. The loss of religion is an enormous demographic reality, and to an extent it establishes the modern template of our society. The men and women I've interviewed for my project on both sides of the Atlantic and who have lost religion tell me in very urgent tones the moral perspective which they need to find to replace their belief in God. There is a drive for an authenticity in their morality, and this journey leads, in very many cases, out of religion. They are creating new campaigns and new ways of establishing moral worth. The statistics will tell, I think, that goodness has been moving inexorably for 70 years towards increasingly a godlessness. This is not to say that those who believe in God do not regard themselves as moral. It's something that has been underway for 70 years and marches on still, driven little by ideology and more for millions of people by making individual decisions about their personhood rather than about their religion. The central group in this process, I would argue, are women. Their personhood is evolving as increasingly godless and newly moralized. Becoming free from God has become a significant feature of modern feminism. In a survey in 2011, Kirsten Owen showed that only 16% of the readership of the largest feminist paper in Britain, Feminist Review, self-describe as either Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or Buddhist. Only 16%. A few subscribe to New Age positions, but the vast majority self-describe as one of atheist, agnostic, or no religion. For the one life we lead, the new civilization holds out the prospect of living a good life. The historian has a role, I think, in trying to discern these big changes in Western civilization. And one of these is, I feel, the irony that the very notion of civilization itself has become rather unfashionable of late, certainly in Europe, though I suspect less so in the United States. Civilization as a term features less in history books than once it did. Civilization seems to hint to many of Christianity itself, that the two are indivisible. Or more broadly, civilization seems to hint of an elitism, of a colonial superiority, of a rank ordering of cultures, and also a rank ordering of religions, of geographies, and of peoples themselves. So civilization seems as a concept, when used in this way, to be about judgment. But the new moral order of godlessness is actually more about equality, diversity, and I would also argue, though more controversially, a benign relativity. It is about the preeminence of pan-humanistic golden rule, of doing unto others as you would have others do unto you. This rule is by far the most common expression I get from my humanist, atheist, and agnostic respondents in my oral history project, the most frequently cited core moral position, and seems to be extremely important to their moral development. So the case remains to be developed that the historian has the capacity to show that humans can be just as good without God, and that in the modern morality, as they see it, we are very possibly crafting something in which those without God wish to be seen as significantly better. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Callum. You have shown both the cliometric, the social, and the personal in that historiographical tour de force of methodologies, all condensed within 40 minutes to challenge or instruct the belief systems of everyone in this room. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again. Congratulations, you're well and truly inaugurated. And as indicated at the beginning, I think we shall now proceed to the reception. But let's thank Callum once again for such a splendid lecture.
Thank you very much.